Hello, and welcome to our Bible study on Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. I'm Edwin Weber. I'm one of the pastors at St. Mark's, and I am happy that you are able to join me in learning more about God's Word. Now, the last time we were together, we talked about the call of Samuel, the young boy who became the high priest of Israel, even though he was only about 11 years old. Samuel also became a prophet and a judge of God's people. He prophesied the fall of the high priest Eli because of the wickedness of his sons, and by which God lifted up Samuel as high priest. And even in our first Bible story today, we will see Samuel acting in this role as both high priest, prophet, and judge. Now, when we talk about the judges, those are leaders of Israel, but they are very different. They are not judges in the sense of our modern sense, nor are they kings. And we'll tease that apart a little bit more as we talk about it today. Now, in this part of the Bible, starting with the book of Judges, there are a lot of stories that involve some sort of basically the same plot points. Which is that God's people forsake God and they turn over their devotion to other gods. And certainly as a consequence of that, God withdraws favor from God's people. And this usually results in God's people being conquered by foreign nations. Now, eventually in this cycle, God will raise up a judge who brings the people back to God and who sees that God's people are liberated. Now, this happens a number of times in the book of Judges, and it shouldn't be all that surprising to see that it happens in Samuel's day too, when he is judge of Israel. Our first Bible passage takes place at a place called Mizpah, which is where Samuel had summoned all of the Israelites to rededicate themselves in service to God. And now this is following the oppression of the Philistines, the same group of people we talked about last week. So let's go ahead and just dive right in, starting in 1 Samuel chapter 7. So Samuel said to all the Israelites, "If you are returning to the Lord with all your hearts, then rid yourselves of the foreign gods and the Ashereths, and commit yourself to the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines." So the Israelites put away their Baals and their Ashtoreths, and served the Lord only. Then Samuel said, "Assemble all Israel at Mizpah, and I will intercede with the Lord for you." When they had assembled at Mizpah, they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. On that day they fasted, and there they confessed, "We have sinned against the Lord." Now Samuel was serving as leader of Israel at Mizpah. When the Philistines heard that Israel had assembled at Mizpah, the rulers of the Philistines came up to attack them. When the Israelites heard of it, they were afraid because of the Philistines. They said to Samuel, "Do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us from the hand of the Philistines." Then Samuel took a suckling lamb and sacrificed it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. He cried out to the Lord on Israel's behalf, and the Lord answered him. While Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel in battle. But that day the Lord thundered with a loud thunder against the Philistines and threw them into such a panic that they were routed before the Israelites. The men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, slaughtering them along the way to a point below Beth-kar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen. He named it Ebenezer, saying, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." So the Philistines were subdued, and they stopped invading Israel's territory. Throughout Samuel's lifetime, the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines. The towns from Ekron to Gath that the Philistines had captured from Israel were restored to Israel. And Israel delivered the neighboring territory from the hands of the Philistines, and there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel continued as Israel's leader all the days of his life. From year to year, he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all these places. But he always went back to Ramah, where his home was, and there he also held court for Israel, and he built an altar there to the Lord. Now, there's several interesting things going on here that I want us to look at. It's such a dramatic story, isn't it? Very tangible. The idea of the Philistines using a religious gathering to attack the Israelites, it's really kind of scary, isn't it? They were all gathered here in that one place at Mizpah to rededicate themselves. And because they were all there, because the Philistines really did seem to want to destroy them, they really are facing total destruction in this story. And it's in that desperate moment that Samuel intercedes on their behalf. This is really interesting because this really is very much like Moses, the way that Moses intercedes on the behalf of the people. And in fact, the very notion of a high priest is one who mediates between the people and God. And we definitely see that Samuel fills this role. As we might expect in this act, Samuel offers a sacrifice to God. This is the sign of devotion. You may notice here that Samuel chooses to offer a young lamb, even saying that it was not yet weaned. Certainly the youth of the lamb represents its purity. This is something that's emphasized in the Torah, that your offering must be without blemish. But there is also this notion that a victim, a sacrifice victim, stands in the place of the people. So that this one pure lamb must suffer in order to liberate God's people. I'm curious, does that remind you of anything? In the New Testament, Jesus is often called the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. This story about Samuel at Mizpah is just one of many stories in the Old Testament that the gospel writers allude to when they talk about Jesus as the Lamb. Now, something else I want to point out real quick is that after the defeat of the Philistines, Samuel puts up a stone to commemorate the event. And Samuel calls that stone Ebenezer. We're not exactly sure what the phrase Ebenezer means, but we're pretty sure it means something like, thus far the Lord has helped us. That's why the author puts that in there. But I grew up at Ebenezer Lutheran Church in Columbia, South Carolina. So this is kind of a special story to me. I remember being a young child and asking my pastor what Ebenezer meant, and he shared this story with me. Moreover, when we sing the hymn, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," you may remember the second verse starts out with that line, "Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come." And that, of course, is a direct allusion to this story, this stone that commemorates the time in which Samuel interceded for the people and God helped the people. Now, of course, here too, we also see that Samuel is certainly held as judge of Israel. He is this person who is the leader of Israel, but his leadership is very different than that of a king or a president, if we were to sort of use modern terms. Modern political understanding fail us here because we don't really have a modern equivalent to a judge in ancient Israel. In a way, it almost seems to suggest that God's law was and is sufficient for civil order. And I suppose that's true. If everyone just followed God's commandments, we would all just be fine. In the book of Judges, it's only during an external existential threat that God raises up a judge, and they serve typically only as long as the crisis continues. The position is not hereditary, unlike a king. And because it's not elected like our presidents today in a modern democracy or any of our leaders in our democracy. But we do see that the people acknowledge one's calling as a judge. Yet, in all forms of earthly leaders, we know that there is a difference here. And so did God's people. And that's the thing, is that in our next story, the people are going to ask for a king. Well, let's see how that goes, shall we? Let's turn now to our second story. Not Samuel 9, my apologies, Samuel chapter 8, starting with verse 1. God's people ask for a king. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Ajab, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them sternly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and his attendants. He will take your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king that you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we will be like the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it to the Lord. The Lord answered, "Listen to them and give them a king." Then Samuel said to the Israelites, "Everyone go back to your town." Now, this passage is a really interesting one. As we can see, Samuel is advanced in his years, and God's people are worried that they won't have a leader after his death. Instead of trusting God, that God would raise up a new judge as needed, they ask for a king, a hereditary position, to rule over the people. Now, the reason the people give for wanting a king is protection. They want a king, they say, to go out and fight their battles for them. Perhaps ignoring the fact, of course, that kings don't typically go out and fight battles for their people. Instead, they get young men to do it for them. What is more is the fact that this request is made out of fear and scarcity. It makes it all the more offensive because we hear in this passage both that Samuel and God take the people's request as a rejection of God himself. The thing is, if they had trusted God and simply followed God's ways, there probably wouldn't be anything to worry about. Or maybe the Israelites were just simply tired of this game, this pattern, that cycle that I mentioned earlier, where they forsake God and God forsakes them. So they face those consequences, and then they need a judge or a priest to intercede on their behalf. Maybe instead what they would rather have is a king in God's place, who would have earthly and kingly matters to deal with, rather than the expectations of God. Samuel, however, he points out to the people the flaws in their perspective. Kings aren't better than God. In fact, Samuel argues that they are worse. They will conscript your young men and make them fight in battles for their glory. Something very different from the battles of Judges, where God's people only take up arms when there is an existential threat. Samuel also points out that the taxation of kings, even excessive taxation, and this is going to be something really important during and after Solomon's reign, something we'll hear about more in a little while. In a way, Samuel asks the people, are you really sure you want a king? And the people say yes, even though their expectations are unreasonable, saying, we want a king over us, that we will be like the other nations again, and with a king to lead us, with a king to go out and fight our battles for us. Never mind the fact that the blessing of being God's people was that they weren't like the other nations. Never mind the fact that kings don't fight battles instead of the people. So at God's behest, Samuel relents and gives the people a king. But who will be this first king of Israel? And what kind of things do we look for in a ruler? And are the things that we humans look for in leadership, how are they different than what God looks for in leadership? So let's look at how the book of Samuel introduces the first king to us, King Saul. There was a Benjamite, a man of standing whose name was Kish, son of Abel, the son of Zahor, the son of Becherath, the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. Now, the man that is described here really does sound like someone who would make a great king. He's got a good family. He's got this long genealogy included. He's described as handsome and tall. He might be the kind of king humans would pick for themselves. But in the end, as we probably know, Saul's kingship would leave a lot to be desired. Now, we're not going to get into the entire story of how Saul was made king. It's a bit convoluted, but you should feel free to read it for yourself if you like. It is found in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verses 1 through chapter 10, verse 25. But the gist of the story is this. Samuel's father loses some donkeys, and Samuel goes to try to find them. Saul goes to try to find them. And they don't have much luck finding the donkeys, so they decide to go to ask for Samuel's help. After all, of course, Samuel is supposed to be this great prophet. Surely he'll know where the donkeys are. But unbeknownst to Saul, God has already spoken to Samuel, saying that the person who shows up, the young man who approaches, that he is the one who will be king. So that is what happens. Saul shows up, Samuel anoints him as king, and Saul then goes about his calling as the first king of Israel. Saul starts his reign as a kind of a warrior king. And most of the time of his reign is going to be spent in battle in one form or another. This makes, the story, both of Judges and Samuel, really makes it clear why Saul is at war. It's because Israel is surrounded by these enemies, and they want nothing more than to see to it that Israel is destroyed. The story of Samuel at Mizpah that we talked about earlier really shows us that, how the Philistines were really wanting to totally destroy God's people. And, additionally, the story that we get overall from Judges to Samuel is that the kingdom has not been fully established yet. In Joshua, it says that Joshua, said that the conquest was never complete. That's why there are these other people, and God's people are in conflict. In a way, ultimately what David will do, unite the whole land under one king, is the fulfillment of the covenant that was made between God and the people at Sinai. And the work of Joshua and the judges ultimately are fulfilled in that. However, Saul's warring ways might be explained by his place in history and in this story. But Saul actually kind of blunders his way through his reign. And perhaps more importantly, this is why God's favor withdraws from Saul and eventually rests on David, who we know will become king. So we need to look at Saul's mistakes. What does he do that's involved here? And the first story involves Saul and his army facing off against the Philistines yet again. Just like at Mizpah, a sacrifice is made in order to find God's favor. But Saul, instead of waiting for Samuel the priest, Saul makes a sacrifice for himself. And in doing so, might have made a blunder. So let's take a look here at this next story. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 13. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks and in pits and in cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offerings. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. Saul replied, "When I saw the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought after a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's commandment." So, an important part of the story here is the notion of obedience. And Samuel makes it very clear. The covenant between God and Saul is conditional. Without obedience, without following God's law, God's favor is lost. And Saul's sacrifice is a really big deal because priests and kings have different roles. In fact, there's actually even a law in the Torah that says that you couldn't both be a priest and a king. And Saul violates this by placing himself in the role that properly belongs to Samuel and offers up the priestly duties. Now, this may not seem all that significant to us today, but it really is a big deal in the day in which this story is being written and told. Consider for a moment the notion of vocation, something that we are intimately in conversation with about today. The roles of priest and king are different. When we take over roles that don't belong to us, we short-circuit the vocational callings of those people. In our everyday life, perhaps we can learn this lesson from Saul, to respect the different roles and boundaries that are in place. By doing so, everyone has the opportunity to live out our vocation. Now, another place that Saul falls short as Israel king concerns his something that's called his rash oath. In this story that we'll hear next, Saul tries to make a deal with God, saying that if my army won't eat any food until we have won the battle against the Philistine. Now, I have to say, right off the bat, I think this is stupid. Who wants an army fighting on an empty stomach? The whole thing is a bad proposition in the first place. And so maybe we're not too terribly surprised when Saul faces consequences for this rash oath. We're now in Samuel chapter 14, and we're going to skip a little bit, we'll read verse 30 and then skip to verse 36. Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food today.' That is why the men are faint." Jonathan said, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of his honey? How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater?" Now Saul said, "Let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive." "Do whatever seems best to you," they replied. But the priest said, "Let us inquire of God here." So Saul asked God, "Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God did not answer him that day. Saul therefore said, "Come here, all of you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today." As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilty lies with my son Jonathan, he must die." But not one of them said a word. Saul then said to all the Israelites, "You stand over there, and I and Jonathan my son will stand over here." "Do what seems best to you," they replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, "Why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is in me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim. But if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim." Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Saul said, "Cast the lot between me and Jonathan, my son," and Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." So Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." Saul said, "My God, deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair on his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. An interesting story. But as it turns out, of course, Saul makes this vow, and someone unwittingly breaks it. And it just so happens to be Saul's son, Jonathan. Jonathan, of course, this really great warrior in the story. We'll hear more about him next week. Jonathan in the story, sees this honey and just can't help himself. And as a result, God's favor is withdrawn. Saul is able to figure it out using the Urim and Thummim. These are a set of stones that were used to cast lots among the kings and priests of Israel. And this is a good story that kind of illustrates the point, how Saul had the lots cast between him and his son in the story. Now, Jonathan's disobedience is perhaps forgivable because he didn't know of his father's command. And even though Jonathan should die for his violation, it doesn't seem very fair. After all, it was Saul who made the rash oath, and Jonathan didn't even know about it at the time. So Jonathan is spared, but Saul continues to have trouble walking the path of being a righteous king. If this has been strike two, we know that he's only got one chance left here. He's only got one more chance to make things right. Unfortunately for Saul, he fails yet again. So let's listen to our last story for today, 1 Samuel 15. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, "Go away and leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt." So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and the lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. "I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions." Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went out to meet Saul, but he was told, "Saul has gone to Carmel." So he set up a monument in his own honor. He has set up a monument in his own honor, and has turned and gone down to Gilgal. So when Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ear? What is the lowing of cattle that I hear?" Saul answered, "The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest." "Enough," Samuel said to Saul. "Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." "Tell me," Saul replied. Samuel said, "Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel and has set you on a mission, saying, 'Go and completely destroy these wicked people, the Amalekites. Wage war against them until you've wiped them out.' Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you not pounce on the plunder and do evil in the sight of the Lord?" "But I did obey the Lord," Saul said. "I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was to be devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal." But Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Then Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel said to him, "I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king of Israel." As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a human being that he should change his mind." Saul said, "I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God." So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Then Samuel said, "Bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites." Agag came to him in chains, and he thought, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women." And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home at Gibesh of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go and see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So we have a lot going on in this passage that we need to unpack, including understanding what's going on here with all these flocks and herds captured in this battle, as well as this person Agag, the king of the Amalekites. Now, our reading today says that Saul and his people were supposed to totally destroy the Amalekites with the sword. Now, that phrase, totally destroyed, is an important one. In Hebrew, the word is haram, and it is in English often translated as totally destroyed, but it means something more complicated. Sometimes in English, we refer to this as the ban, because it is part of God's law banning certain things in warfare. This goes all the way back to Joshua. who relayed this command from God to the people at the start of the conquest. Basically, the ban is a limitation on warfare. In particular, God doesn't want the people waging war for the sake of personal profit. And for that reason, God bans looting in all of its forms, commanding that instead the enemy is to be totally destroyed as an act of dedication to God. Now, to our modern sensibility, this can make us uncomfortable because it doesn't sound very just or good to us, and I agree. But perhaps Saul's story can show us the true problematic nature of what happens when we try to selectively follow God's law. The thing is that it would appear that Saul's motivation and the men's motivation is entirely selfish. He keeps the best flocks and herds for himself. He can't bring himself to destroy the fatted calves, and even though when Samuel, shows up, Saul claims he lies and pretends that what he actually did was to save them in order that they could be sacrificed to God as a means of dedication and praise. But Saul, of course, he overlooks the fact that the ban itself was supposed to be a total dedication to God. And as Samuel so eloquently tells him, God is more concerned with obedience than sacrifices of praise. Now, what is worse, in my opinion, is that Saul spares the life of Agag, the king, while he puts the rest of the Amalekites to the sword and kills the rest. I actually have a really big problem with this. It is an utter miscarriage of justice when there are two separate rules for rulers and rules for everybody else. I'm not sure that it was just in the first place to have all of the Amalekites executed, but it is absolutely, unquestionably, a perversion of justice for the king to be spared the punishment his people endured. So there's a lot going on here today. And now's the time when we kind of look at the big picture. We do see that God's people ask for a king and they get one. But Saul falls way short of being the kind of king that we would maybe hope for or expect. None of the kings are perfect. Even David and Samuel have their own issues. And really, we shouldn't expect any of the kings to be perfect. They are human after all. But for all the failings of the kings, Saul's reign is of particular note, both as the first king of Israel and also as the direct predecessor to David, who is, of course, the first true king of a united Israel. Next time, we're going to look at David, how God called him to be king of Israel after God's favor withdrew from Saul. He'll go on, of course, to fight Goliath, showing his trust and faith in God, and in doing so, he'll find favor among the people. And as we will hear, Saul will grow jealous of David and even try to kill him. But at least for now, that is all. And until next time, thanks for watching and peace be with you.